March 17th, 1917, 50 miles off the coast of Ireland. A German submarine commander stands in his conning tower, watching through binoculars as a small British cargo ship lists badly to port. Smoke pours from her stern. Her crew scrambles across the deck in obvious panic, shouting, stumbling over each other, throwing lifeboats into the water with desperate haste. Some jump overboard without waiting. Others wave their arms at the sky, as if begging God himself to save them. The U-boat commander smiles. This is an easy kill. The torpedo he fired 20 minutes ago must have ruptured her hull. She is dying. Her crew has already given up. There is no need to waste another torpedo on a ship that will sink on her own. He gives the order to surface fully. His gun crew climbs out to man the deck cannon. They will finish her off with shells, save the expensive torpedoes for better targets. The submarine glides closer. 200 yards. 150. The panicking British sailors are rowing frantically away from their doomed vessel. Some are crying. At 100 yards, the U-boat commander prepares to give the order to fire. And then the dying cargo ship transforms. Wooden panels along her hull crash downward, like stage curtains falling. Behind them stand Royal Navy gunners in combat positions. A white ensign snaps up her mast. 4-inch guns swivel toward the submarine with mechanical precision. The panicking sailors in the lifeboats suddenly stop rowing and watch in silence. The first shell strikes the U-boat's conning tower before the German commander can close his mouth. The second tears through the pressure hull. The submarine that surfaced as a predator sinks as prey, her entire crew dead within 90 seconds of the ambush. The cargo ship that was supposedly dying straightens up. Her crew climbs back aboard. The smoke stops. The list vanishes. The ship was never damaged at all. This was not a rescue. This was not luck. This was not a malfunction. This was a Q ship, and the men aboard her had just performed the deadliest piece of theater in naval history. Sa. By 1915, the British Empire was being strangled. And the Germans exploited this with ruthless efficiency. In the first months of unrestricted submarine warfare, U-boats sank merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Cargo vessels loaded with food, fuel, ammunition, and raw materials were being sent to the bottom at a rate that threatened to collapse the entire British war effort. The numbers were obscene. One submarine could sink a dozen ships in a single patrol. Britain imported almost everything necessary to feed its population and supply its armies. If the convoys stopped, the war ended. The Admiralty tried depth charges, but submarines could hear surface ships coming and dive deep before the attack. They tried ramming, but U-boats were faster submerged than most cargo ships were on the surface. They tried arming merchant vessels, but untrained crews with single-deck guns were no match for a submarine captain who could simply torpedo them from a mile away. Nothing worked. By mid-1915, sinkings were outpacing shipbuilding by a ratio of nearly 3-to-1. Churchill himself admitted privately that the U-boat campaign was the only thing that could actually lose the war for Britain. And then someone at the Admiralty asked a question that changed everything. What if the prey could become the predator? The idea was deceptively simple. Take an ordinary merchant ship, the kind the Germans were sinking by the dozen. Strip her of anything valuable. Fill her with cork, empty barrels, and timber, so she cannot sink easily, even if torpedoed. Arm her with hidden guns behind false panels that can drop on command. Train her crew not only to fight, but to act, to perform, to deceive. And then send her out as bait. Let the U-boats find her. Let them think she is defenseless. Let them surface to finish her with deck guns, because torpedoes were expensive, and submarine commanders were under pressure to conserve them. And when the submarine comes close enough to see the terror in the sailor's eyes, drop the disguise, raise the ensign, and destroy the enemy at point-blank range. The British called these vessels Q ships. The Q was supposedly a reference to Queenstown, their original base in Ireland. But the crews called them something else. They called them mystery ships, decoy ships, trap ships. The Germans would later call them something much worse. The first problem was finding men willing to serve on them. A Q ship was, by design, a vessel meant to be attacked. Her mission was to absorb enemy fire, take damage, and convince the Germans she was dying, all while keeping her true nature hidden until the last possible second. The men aboard her had to volunteer for duty, knowing that their best-case scenario was a violent close-range gun battle with an enemy submarine, and their worst-case scenario was being torpedoed and sunk before they ever got the chance to fight back. No decorations were guaranteed. No glory was promised. The entire operation was secret. If they succeeded, almost no one would ever know what they had done. If they failed, they would die anonymously, and the Admiralty would deny the program ever existed. And yet men volunteered. Some were Royal Navy officers who hated the passivity of convoy duty. Some were merchant mariners who had already survived U-boat attacks and wanted revenge. Some were simply men who understood that the war was being lost at sea and believed that desperate times required desperate actions. They were given ships that looked like garbage, rusted tramp steamers, fishing trawlers, colliers so ugly that no self-respecting captain would want to command them. That was the point. Every detail of the disguise had to be perfect. The Germans watched British shipping carefully. They knew what merchant ships looked like, how their crews behaved, what flags they flew, how they responded to attack. A Q ship had to be indistinguishable from the real thing. And this is where the genius of the operation became psychological. The British understood something that most military theorists ignored. They understood that German submarine commanders were human beings, not machines. They had instincts, they had egos, they had expectations, and most importantly, they had a pattern. By 1916, U-boat captains had developed a standard procedure for attacking unarmed merchant ships. First, they would surface at a safe distance and signal the ship to stop. If the ship obeyed, the U-boat would approach and inspect her, often allowing the crew to abandon ship before sinking the vessel with deck gunfire or demolition charges. This was not mercy. It was economy. A 4-inch shell was cheap. A torpedo was expensive. a dead crew could not report the submarine's position. A terrified crew that rowed away in lifeboats and told stories of German efficiency served the U-boat campaign's psychological goals. The British Q-ship commanders studied this pattern and designed a counter. They called it the Panic Party. A panic party was a carefully rehearsed theatrical performance meant to look like chaos. When a U-boat surfaced near a Q-ship, a designated portion of the crew, usually about 1/3, would immediately stage what appeared to be a complete breakdown of discipline. They would run across the deck screaming. They would throw lifeboats over the side in haphazard fashion. They would pretend to fight each other for seats. They would fall into the water deliberately. They would row away from the ship as fast as possible, waving their arms and shouting for help. Some would even bring props, a parrot in a cage, a teddy bear, women's clothing stuffed to look like a captain's wife, anything to make the scene look more realistic, more desperate, more civilian. The performance had to be believable enough to fool a German officer watching through binoculars from several hundred yards away. It had to look like a crew that had completely lost its nerve. It had to look like men who had already given up. It had to look like easy prey. And meanwhile, the rest of the Q-ship's crew, the gun crews, the officers, the fire control teams, stayed completely hidden. They lay flat beneath the false panels, barely breathing, waiting in silence while the submarine approached. Some accounts describe men lying for over an hour without moving while German shells struck the ship around them. One false movement, one face appearing in a porthole, one sailor breaking character, and the entire trap would be revealed. The Germans would dive immediately, and then it was over. Everything depended on discipline. Everything depended on patience. Everything depended on the panic party being convincing enough to draw the submarine within killing range. The first major Q-ship success came on July 19, 1915. HMS Prince Charles, a converted merchant vessel, encountered U-36 off the coast of Scotland. The German submarine surfaced and signaled the Prince Charles to stop. The British captain obeyed immediately, playing the role of a frightened civilian skipper. The panic party launched with flawless precision, abandoning ship in apparent terror. U-36's commander, delighted with the easy target, brought his submarine close to finish her off. At 200 yards, the Prince Charles dropped her disguise. The first shot struck the submarine's conning tower. The second volley smashed through her hull. U-36 attempted to dive, but the damage was too severe. She sank in minutes, taking most of her crew with her. The British had just proven that the tactic worked. But the Germans were not fools, and they learned fast. Within weeks of the first Q-ship kills, reports began filtering back to U-boat headquarters. Commanders who had survived encounters with suspicious vessels warned their colleagues. The word spread through the submarine fleet. Some British merchant ships were not what they appeared to be. The psychological balance began to shift. Before the Q-ships, German submarine commanders had been confident predators. They approached merchant vessels with arrogance, certain that the British had no effective response. They surfaced boldly, often within easy gun range of their targets. They assumed that a fleeing crew meant a defenseless ship. After the Q ships, that confidence cracked. Suddenly, every merchant vessel was a potential trap. Every panicking crew might be acting. Every listing ship might be playing dead. The German commanders began to hesitate. They stayed submerged longer. They torpedoed ships from greater distances. They stopped surfacing to save torpedoes and started spending them freely, because a torpedo fired from a mile away was safer than a close-range encounter with a possible Q ship. The British had turned paranoia into a weapon. But this created a new problem, a terrible problem, a problem the Q-ship crews had never anticipated. The more successful the Q-ships became, the less likely German submarines were to surface at all. And if the Germans stopped surfacing, the entire tactic collapsed. Q-ships depended on close-range gunnery. They had no way to attack a submerged submarine. Their hidden 4-inch guns were useless against a torpedo launched from 1,000 yards away. The Q-ship program had invented a form of psychological warfare so effective that it was beginning to destroy itself. By late 1916, U-boat commanders had standing orders to torpedo all merchant vessels without warning whenever possible. They no longer surfaced to inspect. They no longer gave crews time to abandon ship. They fired from maximum range and moved on. The prize rules that had previously governed submarine warfare, the requirement to warn merchant vessels and provide for their crews, were abandoned entirely. The Q-ships had worked too well. They had forced the Germans to become more brutal, and in doing so, they had made the seas more deadly for everyone, including the very merchant ships the Q-ships were supposed to protect. The Q-ship crews understood this paradox, and they did not care. Their job was not to end the submarine war. Their job was to kill submarines. And even as the Germans grew more cautious, opportunities still arose. Overconfident commanders still surfaced. Inexperienced U-boat captains still fell for the act. Bad weather still forced submarines to the surface where they could be ambushed. And when those moments came, the Q-ship crews were ready. Consider the case of HMS Farnborough, one of the most decorated Q-ships of the war. On March 22, 1916, Farnborough encountered U-68 in the western approaches. The German submarine surfaced and opened fire from long range, clearly suspicious. Rather than immediately drop the disguise, the Farnborough's captain, Lieutenant Commander Gordon Campbell, ordered his crew to continue the performance. The panic party abandoned ship. Campbell himself stayed aboard with his gun crews, hiding beneath the false panels, while German shells struck the vessel. For nearly an hour, Campbell waited. The submarine circled cautiously, firing sporadically, but would not come close. Finally, U-68's commander, apparently satisfied that the ship was genuinely abandoning, brought his submarine within 200 yards to deliver the killing blow. Campbell gave the order. The Farnborough's guns opened fire at point-blank range. 27 shells struck U-68 in under a minute. The submarine sank with all hands. Campbell was awarded the Victoria Cross. His crew received commendations. The Farnborough was repaired and sent back out. She would fight again. 9 months later, Farnborough found herself in an even more desperate situation. On February 17, 1917, she was torpedoed without warning by U-83. The explosion killed several crewmen instantly and caused catastrophic flooding. The ship began to sink. This was exactly the scenario Q-ship crews feared most. Attacked before they could spring their trap, dying before they could fight back. But Campbell refused to abandon the performance. Even as his ship flooded, he ordered the panic party to launch. He kept his gun crews hidden beneath the collapsing deck. He lay flat on the bridge while water rose around him, waiting for the submarine to surface. U-83's commander, watching the apparently dying vessel, eventually decided it was safe to come up and inspect the wreck. He was wrong. When the submarine surfaced at 70 yards, Campbell gave the order. The Farnborough's guns, some of them already half submerged, opened fire. At that range, there was no missing. U-83 was torn apart before her commander could even give an order. Campbell won a bar to his Victoria Cross, making him one of the few men in history to receive the decoration twice. But victory came at a price. Farnborough was sinking fast. Her engines were flooded. She could not move. Campbell and his surviving crew were rescued by another vessel just before she went down. The mathematics were brutal. 1 Q-ship for 1 U-boat, a trade the British could not sustain. And this was the grim arithmetic that defined the Q-ship campaign throughout 1917. The tactics still worked. Submarines were still being sunk. But the Q-ships were taking losses faster than they could be replaced. And worse, the German adaptation to the Q-ship threat, the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, the decision to torpedo all ships without warning, was killing far more merchant vessels than the Q-ships could ever protect. By mid-1917, Britain was losing over 200 ships per month. The Q-ship fleet numbered fewer than 200 vessels total. Even if every single Q-ship achieved a kill, and most never did, they could not have closed the gap. The program that began as a desperate improvisation was becoming a statistical irrelevance. But the men who served aboard Q-ships kept fighting. They knew the mathematics. They knew the odds. They knew that their missions were no longer changing the course of the war. They also knew that every U-boat they killed was 1 fewer submarine hunting the convoys. Every German commander who hesitated to surface was 1 more hour of safety for merchant crews. Every torpedo wasted on a Q-ship was 1 torpedo not fired at a supply ship carrying food to British children. They could not win the battle alone, but they could make the enemy pay for every victory. The psychological toll was extraordinary. Q-ship crews lived in constant tension. Every patrol could last weeks. Every hour required vigilance. They could never let the disguise slip. They could never relax. They had to maintain the illusion of being an ordinary merchant crew even in port, because German spies were everywhere. Some Q-ship sailors were forbidden from writing home for months at a time to prevent any accidental leak of information. And when the moment of action came, they had to transition instantly from passive deception to lethal violence. Imagine lying beneath a wooden panel, hearing German shells strike your ship, watching friends die beside you, and being forbidden to move, forbidden to react, forbidden to even breathe loudly, because the success of the mission depended on the enemy believing you were already dead. Imagine waiting for over an hour in that position, not knowing if the submarine would ever come close enough to engage, not knowing if the next shell would be the one that found your hiding place. Imagine the moment when the order finally came, the adrenaline shock of suddenly rising, throwing off the panel, swinging the gun around, and firing at a target you knew contained men as young as yourself. Some Q-ship veterans described the experience as the longest minutes of their lives, followed by the shortest. The waiting was agony. The killing was instantaneous. And then they had to do it again. Not all Q-ship encounters ended in British victory. Some ended in slaughter. In August 1917, HMS Dunraven, another ship commanded by Victoria Cross recipient Gordon Campbell, encountered UC-71 in the Bay of Biscay. The submarine torpedoed Dunraven without warning, causing massive damage. Campbell attempted the same tactic he had used before, playing dead while waiting for the submarine to surface. But UC-71's commander was not fooled. He circled at long range, watching suspiciously. When he finally surfaced, he stayed over 400 yards away, too far for the Q-ship's guns to guarantee a kill. Campbell opened fire anyway. The shells splashed around the submarine, but failed to sink her. UC-71 dived, repositioned, and torpedoed Dunraven again. The second torpedo struck the engine room. Fires broke out across the ship. The magazine threatened to explode. Campbell finally gave the order to abandon ship for real. The crew evacuated as Dunraven burned. UC-71 escaped. The Q-ship sank within hours. Several men were killed. Many more were wounded. The submarine that destroyed them reported back to base undamaged. The Germans were learning. By late 1917, the Q-ship program was effectively over. Not officially. Ships still patrolled, crews still trained, the Admiralty still issued orders, but the tactical environment had changed beyond recognition. German submarines now attacked almost exclusively with torpedoes. They surfaced only when absolutely necessary. They viewed every merchant ship with suspicion. The element of surprise that made Q-ships effective had been analyzed, countered, and neutralized. The final count was disputed, but historians estimate that Q-ships sank somewhere between 11 and 15 German submarines over the course of the war. Against this, over 200 Q-ships were commissioned, and dozens were lost. The ratio was not impressive by conventional standards. But conventional standards did not apply. The Q-ship campaign was never about winning a war of attrition against submarines. It was about something else, something harder to measure, something psychological. Before the Q-ships, German U-boat commanders hunted with impunity. They surfaced where they pleased, attacked how they chose, and assumed that the British merchant fleet was defenseless prey. After the Q ships, that assumption died. Every merchant vessel became a potential threat. Every easy kill became a possible trap. Every surfacing became a risk. German commanders wrote in their war diaries about the constant anxiety, the hesitation before approaching apparently helpless ships, the fear that a routine gun action might become an ambush. The Q ships did not sink enough submarines to turn the tide, but they planted doubt in the minds of the men who commanded those submarines. And doubt slowed them down. Doubt made them hesitate. Doubt made them waste torpedoes from long range instead of shells from close range. The British could not defeat the U-boats in direct combat, so they made every encounter feel like a potential defeat. They weaponized paranoia. After the war, the Q-ship program was officially acknowledged for the first time. The men who served aboard them received belated recognition. Gordon Campbell's 2 Victoria Crosses were publicized. Memoirs were written. Some Q ships were preserved as monuments. The sailors who survived were allowed, finally, to speak about what they had done. But the full story was never comfortable. Because the Q-ship program existed in a moral gray zone. The vessels flew false flags. Their crews wore civilian clothes. They attacked without warning ships whose commanders believed they were approaching defenseless merchantmen. Under the laws of warfare as understood at the time, this was at minimum controversial and at worst illegal. The Germans protested bitterly after the war. They argued that Q ships were war crimes disguised as tactics. They claimed that the deception justified their own policy of torpedoing without warning. Some historians have agreed. Others have pointed out that submarine warfare itself violated long-standing rules requiring surface ships to provide for the safety of merchant crews before attacking. The debate never ended. What ended was the Q-ship era. The tactic that worked brilliantly in 1915 was obsolete by 1918. It has never been used effectively since. Modern submarines attack from ranges measured in miles, guided by sonar and radar, firing weapons that travel faster than any ship can see them coming. The close-range gun duel that made Q ships possible disappeared from naval warfare forever. Today, the Q ships survive only in books and museums. A few rusted relics remain. Some records have been declassified. Photographs show men in merchant clothing standing beside hidden guns, their faces unreadable, their medals unearned until decades after the fact. They were, and when their victory was invisible, their sacrifice was classified, their legacy was a footnote in the larger story of the submarine war. But the Q ships did not just fight submarines. They proved that deception is a weapon, that theater is a tactic, that psychology matters as much as firepower. The panic. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is fear. And sometimes the best way to kill a predator is to become better prey. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. This channel exists to recover the forgotten corners of military history, the secret operations, the desperate tactics, and the ordinary people who found themselves doing extraordinary things when the stakes were survival itself. Every story like this deserves to be remembered, and every person who shares it helps ensure that it will be.